And so some of the challenge that we in the electoral reform world have, and particularly those of you who have known a lot more about it for a lot longer than I have, is suspending the evidence-based bit of the mind to understand the less evidence-based bit of the head of the politician. And that is the challenge that we in the Labour Party have. Those of you who are not in the Labour Party, or even those of you who are, must have been listening to that and thinking, it's so blindingly obvious, why don't they just do it? I'm tempted to say the main way that we would persuade the Labour Party to back electoral reform is to put Rob Ford in front of the shadow cabinet. And we may yet try that. But the other things, of course, are about how we persuade the party to understand the disadvantage, which I think Rob has set out brilliantly, to accept the evidence, which again, you've set out brilliantly, and to recommit to its core values. And of course, feel some heat. And those two last things are probably what I'm just going to talk a bit about now in explaining the campaign, because in a way we've started the Labour for a New Democracy campaign by just turning up the heat on the party, which, you know, it has been feeling for a very long time. I think Sandy Martin, I can't see him, but he's somewhere in the audience this morning. Sandy, who's the chair of the Labour campaign for electoral reform, which many of you will have supported. I mean, it's been making this case for decades. Other organisations, of course, your own included, have. I think a moment sort of presented itself with the really disastrous results from a Labour perspective of the last general election. There's an opportunity for the party to re-engage with the discussion about electoral reform. And so the Labour campaign for a New Democracy was born. It's got 10 organisations a part of this coalition. Obviously, ERS, to whom we're very grateful. It's brilliant to have the expertise, the reach, the research capacity of people like ERS in the mix. Politics for the Many, which is a genius invention, a group which is by and for trade unionists talking about PR to the trade union movement, and then a number of other organisations, including obviously the Labour campaign for electoral reform and Make Votes Matter. So we formed this coalition, and the first part of the campaign really has been about that turning up the heat from within the Labour Party. And it's been a very Labour-focused campaign driven by Labour Party members. The idea being that if we could at least just prove beyond all reasonable doubt that the membership was unequivocally pro-PR, then we could move on to some of the slightly more complex parts of the Byzantine Labour Party structures in persuading them. So this year, I think we've accomplished that through huge efforts, really. And I can see David Westwood is there. I think he might have been a phone banker, and others of you will have been to constituency Labour Party meetings, have written letters to your constituencies, but through a sort of consistent, just hard organising, really. We had a big push through the constituency Labour parties and went to Labour Party conference in September in Brighton with 324 constituency Labour parties having passed pro-PR policy, which is quite unprecedented. That's, for those of you not familiar with the Labour Party, I mean, amongst friends, the truth is that not all of our CLPs really function. There are, in theory, about 650 in practice. There's probably a good few less. So 324 CLPs backing PR probably means about 65 or 70% of the functioning bodies of the party. We passed 150 conference motions, which was unprecedented. Rob was plugging his Brexit book, and I'm sure many of you followed that as well. Even Brexit didn't get 150 motions on at Labour Party conference. We then, the way the party functions is, having done all of that, you still have to prove that it's something that people want to talk about. So at party conference, then what's called a priorities ballot. That is where all of the delegates have the chance to vote on the issues they want to talk about. And PR came second, second only to housing and ahead of the NHS. So that really illustrates a significant party interest and demand, which was then demonstrated again with the vote, which was 80% of CLP delegates voted to back PR, at which point you probably think, great, we've done it, we can all just go home. But of course, the way the Labour Party votes function is that half of the Electoral College is the membership and half of the trade unions. And the trade union vote is weighted. So although we have a large number of unions who are in favour of PR, the larger unions are not all yet persuaded. And so their weighted vote meant that, in fact, 95% of the union vote at conference went against PR. So we didn't, the one number in the end that really counts, which is that one final yes or no, didn't go our way. However, there were grounds for optimism, even on the trade union side. Most unions, those of you who are in trade unions will know it is very difficult to expect a union, particularly a very large one, which may have kind of quite complex internal democratic decision-making procedures. It's quite difficult to expect a large union to make a big decision at conference. Generally, they'll have discussed things in advance through their own branches, their own union structures, their own congresses, perhaps, their regional structures if they have those. However, Unison, which didn't have pro-PR policy, did abstain, which is a great source of hope for us that they are not far from being moved. And in fact, the Fire Brigades Union, which is a smaller union that didn't have pro-PR policy, actually voted pro-PR. So that was great. However, some of the big beasts in the Labour Party jungle, notably USDOR, GMB and Unite, did not vote for, and so we didn't prevail overall. Within about 3 weeks of Labour Party conference, Unite had its own policy conference. And it's a bit of a shame that COVID and many other things just meant that hadn't happened sooner. But in fact, at Unite's policy conference, they passed a motion which was very explicitly against first past the post and opening up to a process of education about electoral reform across the trade union. So we're already, by the middle of October, in a better place than we had thought we were just at the end of September. And that was already a much better place than we've been in for a very, very long time. So where now? Well, we obviously have to continue building support amongst Labour Party members and keep that momentum going. We have had some more motions pro-PR passed since September, so that is great. We are not yet at our ceiling. With Politics for the Many, and I cannot encourage you enough to continue to support Politics for the Many, because it's really important initiative for us. We've started now to build support groups for PR across unions. We had meetings just this week with people from the FBU, from Unison, with CWU, the communication, Labour Party is full of acronyms, the Fire Brigades Union, the Communication Workers Union, Unison, Unite. We're having discussions at the most senior level in Unite about how we can help with this political education to which they have committed. And I think we are quietly confident that we will win with one or two of the larger unions, partly because I think they are paying attention to the evidence that people like Rob are giving them. Partly perhaps there is a slightly greater sense of detachment in some cases from the Labour Party leadership, so they're maybe thinking slightly more independently, and partly because there is this growing grassroots interest from within their own memberships. So with the party membership and the union membership, we're optimistic. The next sort of layers are obviously the Parliamentary Labour Party, which Rob alluded to. MPs are not necessarily the first people to suggest a system that got them elected as a system that needs changing. But it would be unfair to suggest that we don't have support from MPs who are in very, very safe seats. We definitely do. And we are hopeful that more members of the PLP will now come out with their support for PR as they've seen the strength of membership support, including perhaps those MPs who now have to be reconfirmed by their constituency Labour parties if they'd like to carry on being MPs. So there's some sort of soft pressure we can apply there. As things currently stand, about 20% of the Parliamentary Labour Party supports first past the post. About 35% are proudly pro-PR, and the balance of about 45% are undeclared. I think at least half of those towards, but they're all hedging their bets. and they're hedging their bets until the leadership moves. And this is the final bit of the jigsaw, and it's obviously in many ways the most important one, which is where are the senior figures in the party? Keir, in his leadership campaign, you will all remember, or I'm sure you'll all have noticed, made a statement which made it very clear that he understood the limitations of first past the post, and reflecting on his own experience, obviously in Holborn and St Pancras, he acknowledged the quite frankly ludicrous situation that Rob talked about, with the huge number of wasted votes that you have in safe seats, and he's sitting in a pretty safe seat himself. So I'm absolutely certain that he understands, he understands the limitations of first past the post, and he gets the democratic imperative from the membership. Where the nerves come in, I think, are partly, again, as Rob alluded to, we've done it before, we've won on our own, we've won big, well, we can win, we can win under this system, and then we'll have other things to think about. The complexities for Labour in acknowledging that this system is increasingly difficult for it to win obviously lead into a discussion about electoral coalitions and tactical campaigning and tactical voting and building coalitions, and all of those are difficult conversations for the Labour Party. It's not constitutionally inclined to want to talk about sharing power, even though on any rational analysis, such as the one that Rob just gave, it is highly likely that it will end up having to share power. But the sort of illusion between electoral reform and winning elections, and what you need to say to win elections, makes this complicated. I think there are arguments are starting to cut through. There are a number of people in the shadow cabinet who are pro PR. Obviously, people like Johnny Reynolds, who you remember a few years ago actually tried to put a bill into Parliament. He's now been promoted in the shadow cabinet. Wes Streeting has just been promoted in the shadow cabinet. I think if PR were the thing that was keeping Keir awake at night, and he doesn't want any pro-PR people in his very inner tent, the fact that he's just promoted a number would indicate that that's not the case. So people will often say he's really against. I don't think he is really against. I don't think he's just yet prepared to be publicly that for. And actually, that's a lot of political movement required between those two positions. So that is now our collective task. I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks again to ERS, a brilliant partner in our coalition. It's really valuable for what is quite a small core team to be able to tap into the expertise of people like Jess. So thank you to you all for your support.